He doesn't know what awaits him. Emmanuel Macron's whisper was picked up by the microphone he had forgotten to turn off. The words echoed across the grand ballroom of the International Conference Center in Washington, D.C., causing a sudden silence among his aides. The technological indiscretion, so rare for a leader known for his meticulousness, was no accident. It was calculated. In the anteroom reserved for the French delegation, the mood of anticipation was almost palpable. High-definition monitors displayed live images of the conference center's corridors and the delegations arriving. Aides moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra, while security analysts checked one last time the details of the meticulously planned diplomatic operation. If you want to know the truth that the great powers try to hide, subscribe now and activate the bell. This story will change your view on international relations forever. Is Paris confirmed for the broadcast? Macron asked, adjusting the knot of the navy blue Hermès tie that complemented his tailored Italian suit. The contrast with the simplicity of the clothes he expected to see on his opponent was not mere vanity. It was a visual statement of power and sophistication that would precede his words. Yes, Mr. President. Élysée, Quai d'Orsay and all French embassies in Africa are connected, confirmed Laurent Dubois, his communications chief, checking a tablet covered in notifications. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, France 24, in all, 114 countries will receive the broadcast. The simultaneous translation system is operational in 23 languages. A barely perceptible smile tugged at the corner of Macron's lips as he closed the blue folder bearing the gold seal of the French Republic. The document in his hands was the culmination of 3 weeks of intense work by French intelligence, a devastating dossier on Burkina Faso's economic and military weaknesses, carefully structured to appear objective while highlighting areas of vulnerability. Are the Americans aware? Asked Philippe Etienne, his longtime diplomatic advisor. The State Department has been informed, Macron replied, the ambiguity in his voice conveying exactly the level of collaboration he wanted. They understand that stabilizing our traditional areas of influence in Africa benefits everyone in the West, especially with the Russian and Chinese advances in the region. Sophie Mercier, the senior advisor on African affairs, approached with a tense expression. Her expertise in Franco-African relations made her particularly aware of the risks of the strategy. Mr. President, analysts in Ouagadougou suggest that Traoré may be more prepared than we anticipated. Our contacts indicate unusual movements at their embassy in the past 48 hours. Macron dismissed the concern with an elegant hand gesture. Sophie, you know these young African military men. Full of revolutionary ideology, but with no real experience in international diplomacy. No matter how prepared he thinks he is, he will never be enough for this stage. The aide nodded, although her gaze revealed doubts that the hierarchy did not allow her to express. In her 15 years studying African political dynamics, she had learned never to underestimate leaders who came to power through extraordinary circumstances. Make sure everything is being recorded. Macron ordered the technical team as they fine-tuned the final details of the broadcast. I want the world to witness when we put this young African soldier in his place. Behind the scenes, French security personnel monitored communications with Paris. A senior officer from the DGSE, Directorate General for External Security, was in constant contact with operatives positioned strategically around the conference center. What was at stake was not just a bilateral meeting, it was the reassertion of the French model of influence on the African continent, which was increasingly threatened by new nationalist leaders. The 5 information operations are active, the official confirmed to Macron's chief of staff in an encrypted channel. The materials are ready for distribution to journalists as soon as the meeting is over. A veiled reference to the set of documents that would be leaked in due course to the international press, reinforcing the French narrative about instability and corruption in Burkina Faso. Outside, under the scorching July sun that beat down on the American capital with a merciless 39 degrees Celsius, the diplomatic convoy from Burkina Faso had just passed through the rigorous security checkpoint. 3 black armored sedans, modest compared to the limousines of other delegations, parked in a perfect row. In the central vehicle, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, 34, was reviewing handwritten notes in a simple notebook. No tablets, no smartphones, a meticulous operational security that reflected his military background. Beside him were folders containing documents that few in the conference room would expect him to possess. Latest information from our analysts in Paris, said Moussa Diallo, his closest advisor, handing him a sealed envelope. They confirm that they are planning a global broadcast. They are calling it a diplomatic lesson in the inner circles of the Quai d'Orsay. Traoré nodded slightly, absorbing the information without showing any surprise. He knew the French playbook well. He had studied every diplomatic confrontation between Paris and its former colonies over the past 50 years during his military training. When he finally stepped out of the vehicle, the contrast was clear. Instead of the business suit expected of leaders at international forums, Traoré wore his impeccable military uniform, no excessive decorations, just the insignia denoting his rank and a discreet national flag on his lapel. Every element of his attire was a deliberate choice, a symbol of his position as a revolutionary leader who would not abandon his origins to conform to Western expectations. The small delegation from Burkina Faso, just 5 people compared to the 15 aides who accompanied Macron, was making its way through the monumental atrium of the conference center. Diplomats and journalists watched with barely concealed curiosity as the young African soldier who in recent months had openly challenged decades of French influence in the Sahel region. "They set it up for a show," observed Amadou Kabor, the foreign minister, quietly indicating the strategically placed cameras. "CNN on the left, France 24 on the right, and that equipment in the corner is from Al Jazeera." Traoré absorbed the information without altering his measured stride. His eyes, however, registered every detail of the environment: exit positions, the location of security guards, points of vulnerability. Military discipline never abandoned him, even in diplomatic halls. "Sir, are you sure you want to go ahead with the meeting?" his closest aide asked as they approached the final anteroom. "We have received information that this may be a media ambush. Our sources in Paris confirm that they have prepared a specific dossier to discredit you." For a moment, Traoré paused before the imposing oak double doors that led into the main hall. Above them, the flags of dozens of nations fluttered in the artificial breeze of the air conditioning, symbols of sovereignty aligned in perfect theoretical equality that rarely translated into actual power relations. His dark eyes reflected unwavering determination as he finally replied, his voice low enough to reach only his nearby team. "They think they are going to humiliate us in front of the world. They have no idea what we bring with us today." Adjusting the set of documents he carried, he added, "For 70 years, they wrote our history. Today, we write our own." With a brief wave to his team and a final glance at his watch, exactly 1 minute before the appointed time, a calculated punctuality, Traoré advanced toward the doors that opened onto what would be, though no one in the room knew it yet, a defining moment in relations between Africa and Europe. The Richardson Ballroom of the International Conference Center had not been chosen by chance. Its perfect acoustics, theatrical lighting, and layout that vaguely resembled a Roman amphitheater made it the ideal setting for what the French organizers had internally dubbed the Washington Lesson. The flags of the participating nations hung from the high ceiling, their vibrant colors contrasting with the teal of the hardwood paneled walls. The room had been carefully prepared since dawn. Sound technicians positioned microphones with calibrated sensitivity to capture even the most discreet sighs. Lighting experts adjusted the spotlights to favor the angle of Macron's assigned seat, creating a subtle presidential halo that the cameras would capture without the audience consciously noticing the visual manipulation. Representatives from 47 countries occupied their designated positions, forming a gradient of geopolitical power. France's closest allies, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, were strategically positioned in the front seats. African delegations were relegated to the sides, except for Morocco and Senegal, staunch allies of Paris who were given privileged seats. The geography of the room was a physical representation of the international hierarchies that Macron sought to reinforce. In the upper press boxes, journalists from 64 international media outlets adjusted equipment and checked connections. The buzz behind the scenes was palpable. Few diplomatic events received so much media attention in peacetime. It was not every day that a European leader publicly confronted one of the new African problems, challenging the post-colonial order. "It's practically a courtroom, not a bilateral meeting," an Al Jazeera journalist observed to her colleague. "Look at how they've arranged the chairs. Traoré will practically be in the dock." At 10:02 a.m., exactly 2 minutes after the scheduled time, a delay calculated to establish dominance, the main doors opened to admit Emmanuel Macron. The French president strode forward with the characteristic confidence that political analysts described as his Jupiterian walk, a reference to his conception of the presidency inspired by the Roman god. His entourage of 15 people filed into the room in a studied formation, first the security advisors, then the technical experts, and finally the senior diplomats. Sophie Mercier, an expert on African affairs, stood discreetly to the president's right, ready to whisper background information if needed. Macron executed his diplomatic choreography with the precision of a skilled dancer. Calibrated smiles, wide for Western delegations, cordially restrained for Asian representatives, paternally warm for African delegates. Each handshake lasted just long enough to allow for favorable photographs, without appearing forced or artificial. The cameras followed him obsessively, drawn to the aura of power he meticulously cultivated. His eyes, a piercing blue highlighted by strategic lighting, seemed to be searching for something at the opposite entrance to the room, an adversary who had not yet arrived. "Broadcast confirmed to 114 countries, Mr. President," whispered Du Bois, his communications chief, surreptitiously slipping a small communication device into Macron's ear. "Audience ratings already surpassing the last UN session." Paris is euphoric. The French president allowed himself a small smile. The pieces on the board were in place. Years of experience in international relations, 3 presidential terms in France, and countless diplomatic confrontations had honed his skills for this moment. The narrative was practically written in newsrooms around the world, the sophisticated European leader giving a lesson in realpolitik to the inexperienced young African soldier. The murmur in the hall abruptly died down when, at 10:07 a.m., the side doors opened without formal announcement. The discreet and unexpected entrance from the side, bypassing the protocol that required passing through the main entrance, was the first sign that Ibrahim Traoré would not follow the script. The Burkina Faso captain advanced with the economy of movement characteristic of soldiers in potentially hostile territory. No forced smiles, no performances for the cameras. His measured steps and erect posture exuded the quiet confidence of someone who had faced life-or-death situations far more intimidating than a room full of diplomats. The youth of his face, 34, nearly half the age of many of the leaders present, contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. Eyes that had witnessed the brutal reality of the extremist insurgency in the Sahel, the devastating effects of neocolonial economic policies, and the complex maneuvers of foreign powers vying for influence and resources in the region. On the lapel of his meticulously pressed olive-green uniform was just a small pin bearing the tricolor of Burkina Faso, red symbolizing the blood spilled for independence, green representing the country's natural abundance, and a gold star symbolizing the light of revolutionary socialism that had guided leaders like Thomas Sankara, whose memory still inspired generations of young Africans. His entourage, made up of just 4 people, a foreign minister, a military advisor, an economic expert, and a communications technician, formed in tight formation. The modest numerical size of the Burkina Faso delegation compared to the army of advisors accompanying Macron did not go unnoticed by the most attentive observers. The noise of cameras grew louder. This was not the shy African leader, dazzled by the international stage, that many had expected. The calmness in his expression disconcerted some of the European diplomats who were expecting signs of nervousness or insecurity. "He brought documents," Philippe Etienne quietly observed to Macron, discreetly indicating the black briefcase carried by Traoré's aide. It was not in the briefing that he would come prepared with his own materials. Macron dismissed the remark with an almost imperceptible gesture. What could a young soldier from a small African country have prepared that would pose any challenge to France's arsenal of information and diplomatic resources? The debate moderator, a career Canadian diplomat chosen for his reputation for neutrality, stepped to the center. Gregory Thompson had brokered peace negotiations in South Sudan and tense trade talks between the United States and China, but even he felt the extraordinary weight of the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special session of the Global Cooperation Summit." He began with the necessary formality. "Today we have the honor of facilitating a bilateral dialogue between the French Republic and Burkina Faso, focused on economic cooperation and regional security in the Sahel." Thompson had barely completed the formal introductions when Macron, in a maneuver clearly calculated to establish dominance over the dynamics of the meeting, leaned forward slightly, activating his microphone before he was even called upon to speak. The perfectly positioned spotlights highlighted the lines on his face, giving him the elder statesman look that the French image directors had meticulously planned. The cameras captured every nuance of his carefully rehearsed performance, which had been staged in dozens of mock-ups at the Élysée over the previous week. "Captain Traoré," Macron began, emphasizing the military title as if to highlight an inadequacy, his voice modulated to convey both authority and carefully calibrated condescension. "Allow me to express the international community's concern about the recent developments in Burkina Faso." The word, developments, was loaded with implicit meanings, provoking discreet smiles among some European diplomats who understood the code perfectly, a reference to the seizure of power by young military personnel and the country's removal from the French sphere of influence. "As a young leader," he continued, his fatherly tone undoubtedly calculated to belittle his interlocutor, "you may not be aware of the complex economic challenges your country will face if it continues to reject the frameworks of cooperation established by France and the European Union." The emphasis on the word, established, carried the weight of decades of economic arrangements that kept African nations in a position of dependence. The CFA franc controlled by Paris, unbalanced trade agreements, mineral concessions at rates fixed during the colonial era. The room waited in suspense for the answer. In the press boxes, journalists leaned forward, anticipating the moment when the inexperienced African leader would be diplomatically massacred by the sophisticated French president. In newsrooms around the world, editors were already preparing predictable headlines about the diplomatic lesson that was unfolding. On social media, the live broadcast was racking up viewers at an unprecedented rate. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, young people crowded into cafes and public squares to watch the clash on makeshift screens, cheering on the man who embodied their hopes for true independence. Traoré remained motionless for precisely 3 seconds, long enough for the silence to become slightly uncomfortable, but not long enough to feel like hesitation. It was a technique he had learned during military interrogations, the power of measured silence to unsettle a confident opponent. With a deliberately slow movement, he adjusted his microphone. His eyes briefly scanned the room, registering every reaction, every expression of condescending expectation, before settling directly on Macron with an intensity that made the French president imperceptibly straighten his posture. "Mr. President Macron," Traoré began, his voice surprisingly calm and articulate, his French perfect, in contrast to the expectations of many Europeans present. No pronounced accent, no grammatical hesitation that could be exploited as a sign of intellectual inferiority. "Before I respond to your concern," he continued, the brief pause before the word perfectly emulating the condescension previously directed at him, "I would like to ask a question that may help contextualize our discussion for viewers around the world." The subtle shift in dynamic, from passive respondent to questioner, prompted a slight frown from Macron, a micro-expression of annoyance captured by the high-definition cameras. Then, with a precise movement that captured the attention of every person in the room, Traoré removed from the inside pocket of his uniform a small metal object, roughly the size of a euro coin. The Burkinabe captain's long, steady fingers carefully placed the object on the table, positioning it so that it was perfectly visible to both Macron and the cameras. The silence in the room grew more intense as the camera's zoom lenses focused on the small device. It was clearly a sophisticated piece of listening equipment, with the characteristic design of French military technology, including a tiny, barely discernible seal bearing the logo of Thales, the French defense giant. "Could you explain to the world?" Traoré continued, his voice now amplified by the absolute silence that had gripped the hall. "Why we found this French spy device in our ministerial meeting room last week?" The question hung in the air like a slow-motion projectile. In control rooms around the world, broadcasters frantically ordered close-ups of the device and Macron's expression. In Paris, presidential aides watching the broadcast at the Élysée exchanged alarmed glances. The first round of diplomatic confrontation was over, and no one in the room had anticipated the direction it was taking. On the giant screen set up in the Place de la Révolution in Ouagadougou, thousands of Burkinabés watched in tense silence, before a collective roar of approval began to rise in the streets. The leadership that many had questioned because of its youth had just shown the world that it was far from naive or unprepared. The silence that followed the revelation of the spying device was the kind that seems to bend space and compress time. In that sonic vacuum, only the low hum of ventilation systems and the mechanical clicking of cameras could be heard. The 2.7 seconds of absolute silence, timed later by political communications analysts, stretched out like an eternity for Emmanuel Macron. The high-definition cameras captured the exact moment when the French president's confident expression crumbled. First, a barely perceptible dilation of the pupils, the involuntary reflex of someone who has received an unexpected shock. Then, a slight widening of the knuckles as his hands discreetly gripped the edge of the table. Finally, a paleness that gradually crept up his neck to his cheeks, replacing the controlled flush of diplomatic confidence with a lividity that no amount of communication training could prevent. On the monitors in the media center 3 floors below, veteran journalists of global conflicts watched in amazement as the power dynamics shifted. "Mon Dieu!" a Le Monde correspondent murmured, breaking her own code of professional neutrality. In the French delegation's control room, technicians and aides exchanged alarmed glances as the meticulously constructed plan began to unravel. Sophie Mercier, an advisor on African affairs, frantically scribbled a note and tried to pass it to Macron, but the French president, aware of the cameras catching his every move, pretended not to notice. Experience told him that any visible hesitation, any consultation with advisors at this point, would be interpreted as a sign of weakness. In the opposite corner of the room, African diplomats from several nations shifted in their seats, many instinctively leaning forward like spectators at a crucial sporting event. Decades of frustration built up at international conferences, where their voices were systematically diminished or ignored, crystallized in this moment of unexpected reversal. "This," Traoré continued after allowing the silence to do its work, pointing to the device with a calm gesture that contrasted with the palpable tension in the room, "is just a small example of how the real relationship between France and its former colonies works." His voice maintained the same controlled cadence, devoid of the triumphant emotion that many in his position would betray. Military training and years of facing terrorist insurgencies in the Sahel had taught him the value of emotional discipline under extreme pressure. "But I am not here to talk about espionage today, Mr. President," he continued, deliberately softening his tone to create a rhetorical contrast. "I am here to talk about numbers. Because while words can be manipulated in diplomatic communications, numbers tell a much clearer story about the relations between our nations." With a subtle gesture, a movement of his right hand that might have gone unnoticed by casual observers. Traoré signaled to his aide. The man, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored suit, stepped forward with almost military precision and placed a worn black leather briefcase on the table. The contrast with Macron's royal blue briefcase, with its golden seal of the French Republic, did not go unnoticed by the most attentive observers. A simple workbook versus a symbol of institutional authority, a visual microcosm of the differences between the two leaders and their approaches. Your advisors have probably provided you with data on our economic dependence, Traoré said as he opened the folder with deliberately slow movements, building narrative tension like a conductor manipulates tempo in a symphony. Let me present other numbers that may not be in your folder. In the technical control room of the conference center, the American engineers responsible for the broadcast nervously monitored global audience levels. What had begun as a standard diplomatic broadcast, intended to attract mainly international relations experts and students, was turning into a real-time viral phenomenon. We're surpassing 175 million concurrent viewers, a technician reported, frantically adjusting settings to avoid overloading the servers. Al Jazeera has just stopped all regular programming for continuous streaming. BBC and CNN have followed suit. Trending on X shows an explosion of hashtags in 43 languages. The technical supervisor, a 3-decade veteran of international broadcasting, had never witnessed anything like it. Increase bandwidth and keep all cameras operational, he ordered. We are documenting history in real time. Traoré pulled out a document and placed it under the projection camera on the table. Immediately, the screens on the sides of the room displayed a detailed and meticulously structured graph showing financial flows between Burkina Faso and France over 5 decades. Colored bars indicated values in billions of euros, with directional arrows highlighting the disproportionate movement of capital. In 60 years of supposed independence, he explained, his voice now taking on the didactic tone of a university professor, Burkina Faso has transferred to France the equivalent of 8 times the amount it received in international aid. His hands made air quotes as he pronounced, international aid. The gesture captured perfectly by the cameras in a frame that would show on global television his serene face with the overwhelming graph as a backdrop, an image that would become iconic on social media in the hours that followed. Our country is home to 14 French military bases. He continued, moving on to the next slide that showed a detailed map of West Africa dotted with military installations, the maintenance costs of which are paid for by our national budget, while 73% of mineral exploration contracts on our territory belong to French companies that pay royalties at rates fixed in 1973. The emphasis on the date, 1973, provoked expressions of surprise among some younger diplomats, who may not have been aware of the longevity of neocolonial economic arrangements. On the split screens of television broadcasts, economic analysts were already beginning to confirm Traoré's figures, citing IMF reports and independent academic studies. The room was utterly silent, everyone's attention riveted by the clinical precision of the presentation. On monitors in the parallel press rooms, journalists watched as editors-in-chief in New York, London, Paris and Doha frantically ordered headlines to be rewritten in real time. At the Place de la Nation in Ouagadougou, where the nighttime temperature was still above 30 degrees Celsius, the crowd watching the giant screens had doubled in the last few minutes. Men and women of all ages, many wearing traditional Mossi and Diola dress, watched in reverential silence, occasionally breaking into subdued applause when the graphics revealed truths long felt but rarely articulated in international forums. He's speaking for all of us, a college professor murmured to his teenage son. Not just for Burkina Faso, but for an Africa that rarely has a voice in these halls. Back in Washington, Macron tried to regain control of the situation. Years of political debate had taught him that the best defense against inconvenient events was a swift rhetorical offensive. Leaning toward his microphone with an expression of studied patience, he interrupted. Captain, this data clearly did not consider infrastructure investments and, with all due respect, Mr. President. Traoré cut through the interruption firmly but without aggression, his voice maintaining the same controlled tone that contrasted with the slight rise in volume in Macron's. Allow me to finish. In your speech in Ouagadougou in 2017, you promised the end of the CFA franc and a new era in France-Africa relations. The mention of the 2017 speech provoked a barely perceptible reaction from Macron, a brief jaw twitch captured on high-definition cameras. That speech, full of promises of equality and renewed cooperation, had been his most popular moment on the African continent. Now his own words were coming back like a diplomatic boomerang. 6 years later, Traoré continued, turning a page in his folder to reveal new data. The colonial monetary system remains intact, forcing our nations to keep 50% of our international reserves in Paris, at negative interest rates. The mention of negative interest rates drew murmurs from the economists present. It was a technicality rarely mentioned in public discussions of the CFA franc, but devastating in its implications. African nations effectively paying France to control their currency reserves. When we decided to diversify our trade partnerships with China and Russia, Traoré continued, his voice now betraying the first hint of restrained emotion, not anger but heightened determination, we began to suffer systematic attempts at destabilization. A news slide appeared on the screens, security maps showing insurgent movements before and after announcements of mining contract reviews. Interestingly, extremist groups in the north of the country received new equipment just after we announced the review of mining contracts with French companies. Equipment, he added with a measured pause, whose serial numbers indicate European origin, specifically from the Gao logistics base. The cameras caught the exact moment when the French delegation began to visibly agitate. Philippe Etienne, the senior diplomatic advisor, hurriedly passed the note to Macron, who read it quickly. The French president's face, trained by years of political crises to maintain composure under pressure, now showed unmistakable signs of alarm. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for a strategic exit from a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his control. The note, as would later be revealed by a disgruntled Quai d'Orsay employee, contained just 5 words. He has the classified documents. By classified documents, he meant internal DGSE reports on French operations to destabilize African governments that threatened French economic interests, documents that Paris believed were absolutely safe in its encrypted systems. The mere possibility that Traoré possessed copies represents an unprecedented diplomatic and intelligence nightmare. The young leader you hope to humiliate today, Traoré continued, his voice now taking on a quality that mixed firmness with an almost professorial dignity, grew up watching his country systematically drained by colonial agreements disguised as partnerships. He closed his briefcase with a deliberate movement before concluding. I'm not the one who needs lessons in economic complexity, Mr. President. Then, in a move that surprised both his own delegation and the French one, Traoré looked away from Macron and directly at the cameras. It was a subtle break in diplomatic protocol, speaking to the world rather than to his official interlocutor, but a highly effective one. True African independence is not a threat to France, he said, each word carefully articulated for maximum clarity, but to a neocolonial system that enriches the few at the expense of the many. We are ready for true partnerships based on mutual respect, not on disguised domination. The silence in the room was absolute, thick enough to be almost tangible. Among the diplomats present, even those most seasoned in international crises recognized that they were witnessing a historic moment, not just a diplomatic reversal, but an unprecedented articulation of inconvenient truths in the very corridors of global power. In African capitals, from Dakar to Nairobi, from Pretoria to Cairo, crowds were beginning to spontaneously gather in front of giant screens set up in public squares. Applause and cheers in various languages and dialects rang out as a continent often silenced in international forums unexpectedly found an eloquent voice. In newsrooms around the world, editors scrambled to tweak headlines. What had been pre-written as "Macron reaffirms commitment to Africa" was hastily replaced with variations on "African leader confronts France over accusations of neocolonialism." And at the center of this geopolitical hurricane, Emmanuel Macron, the president who had built his international reputation as a master of oratory and media diplomacy, found himself in unfamiliar territory, silenced not by force, but by indisputable truths presented with the precision of a diplomatic surgeon. Chapter 4: The World Watches Transformation, Expanded Version, for Emmanuel Macron's aides, veterans of countless diplomatic crises over 3 French presidential administrations, the seconds that followed Traoré's speech were the longest of their careers. The digital clock on the wall read 10:37, but time seemed distorted, stretched by the gravity of the historic moment unfolding before their dismayed eyes. The French president, internationally acclaimed for his eloquence and presence of mind, the man who had debated Trump, confronted Putin and navigated the turbulent waters of Brexit with ease, was visibly unsettled. The change was subtle but unmistakable to trained observers. His hands, normally steady and expressive, trembled slightly as he rearranged papers that did not need rearranging. The slight moistening of his lips, the cadenced breathing that revealed a conscious effort to maintain his composure. Sophie Mercier, his Africa specialist, was frantically scribbling messages on her tablet, communicating with the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, where diplomats on duty were awaiting instructions on how to manage what was quickly becoming a crisis of historic proportions for France's Africa policy. "We need a diplomatic timeout," whispered Laurent Dubois, the communications director, urgently, leaning over the presidential chair. "The ministry's servers are being inundated with requests to verify the data submitted. We need time to formulate a coherent response." The live broadcast was reaching record audiences, surpassing even events like American presidential debates and the World Cup finals. In Paris, what had begun as small gatherings in cafes and bars quickly turned into spontaneous gatherings. On the Place de la République, African students and anti-colonial activists had attached makeshift projectors to the facades of historic buildings, broadcasting the confrontation to growing crowds. In the posh 16th arrondissement, a traditional stronghold of France's conservative elite, executives from mining and energy companies with operations in Africa watched grimly on their smartphones, exchanging alarmed messages about possible repercussions on financial markets. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, what had begun as a gathering of university students to watch the diplomatic showdown had become a spontaneous national event. The Place de la Nation, renamed several times throughout the country's turbulent political history, from Place de la Nation to Place de la Revolution during the Sankara era, and back again, was now completely overrun. Thousands of people packed the space, many holding phones aloft to broadcast live to relatives in remote villages without internet access. Street vendors handed out free water and snacks in a rare moment of national unity that transcended ethnic and political divides. Children sat on their parents' shoulders and watched curiously, unwittingly witnessing a moment that would be written into their history books years later. "This is the first time I have seen our country represented like this on the world stage," a retired teacher told the group around him, his voice choked with emotion. "Not as an object of pity or charity, but as a nation demanding justice and fairness." In newsrooms around the world, editors-in-chief were calling emergency meetings. In London, the BBC was interrupting its regular programming to provide live analysis. In Doha, Al Jazeera analysts were contextualizing the moment for audiences in the Arab world and beyond. In Washington, international affairs experts were rushed to the studios of CNN and Fox News, many admitting behind the scenes that they needed to quickly brush up on their knowledge of French colonial history in West Africa. On digital platforms, the confrontation went viral on an unprecedented scale. 30-second excerpts of Traoré's speech were shared millions of times within minutes. Linguists noted with fascination how the hashtag #Traoré adapted phonologically in dozens of languages, maintaining its globally recognizable essence while taking on local characteristics. In Silicon Valley, data engineers at Meta and X were struggling to manage the largest spike in simultaneous traffic ever recorded around a single unplanned event. "It's bigger than the SpaceX moon landing," said one technician, staring in astonishment at the rising numbers on his monitors. "I request a brief interval for consultations," Jean-Yves Le Drian, France's foreign minister, said, rising abruptly from his seat in the second row. It was a classic diplomatic maneuver to buy time in a difficult situation, a request for a pause that would normally be granted out of formal courtesy. The Canadian moderator, Gregory Thompson, whose neutrality had been carefully assessed before his selection, now found himself in a situation unprecedented in his 22-year diplomatic career. His professional instinct told him that granting the recess would be standard procedure. But something about the historic moment he was witnessing, something about the fundamental injustice being exposed, made him hesitate. After a barely perceptible pause, Thompson dismissed the request with a subtle nod, continuing as if the interruption had not occurred. It was a micro-decision that diplomatic historians would later recall as a turning point, the moment when traditional Western protocol gave way to the moral force of an inconvenient truth. "President Macron," Thompson said, pushing the microphone slightly toward the French leader in a move that the cameras captured in dramatic close-up. "Would you like to respond to Captain Traoré's remarks?" The Richardson Room, normally a space for measured and predictable diplomatic conversations, had been transformed into something else entirely, a makeshift global courtroom where centuries of asymmetrical economic arrangements were finally exposed under the unforgiving lights of global digital broadcasting. Macron cleared his throat, adjusted his tie again, and attempted a diplomatic smile that did not reach his eyes. A veteran of countless political debates and international summits, the French president instinctively resorted to the strategy that had served him well during previous crises, a combination of complex technocracy and personal charm. "Captain Traoré presents an interesting but significantly simplified view of complex economic relationships that have developed organically over decades," he began, his voice regaining some of its usual assurance as it found refuge in the abstract language of international diplomacy. The word, organically, hung in the air as a linguistic challenge to the concept of colonial imposition, a subtle reworking of history that did not go unnoticed by the historians present. "France has been a loyal partner or predator, Mr. President." Traoré's interruption was gentle, almost respectful in its intonation, but devastatingly effective in its precise timing. There was no aggression in his voice, just an unbreakable clarity that made the question all the more powerful. "Your own economists, like Thomas Piketty, have already extensively documented how the current system drains capital from Africa. These are not the claims of a young, inexperienced military officer," he continued, referring to Macron's own condescending words from earlier in the meeting. "These are economic facts published by internationally respected French academics in Parisian institutions." The reference to Piketty, one of the most celebrated contemporary French economists, whose studies on global inequality had been praised by Macron himself in domestic speeches, struck the French president like a precise blow. It was the perfect rhetorical strategy, to use France's own intellectual references against the country's official narrative. On social media, excerpts from the confrontation were already going viral at an unprecedented rate. The hashtag #TraorésMacron dominated global trends, accompanied by variations such as #FreeAfrica and #neocolonialism exposed. Linguists noted with interest how the same hashtag adapted phonologically in dozens of different languages, while maintaining its globally recognizable essence. In real time, edited clips compared Traoré's exhibition with scenes from films like Black Panther, and historic speeches by leaders like Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara, creating a visual bridge between inspirational fiction, revolutionary history, and the present reality unfolding before a global audience. At Harvard, Princeton, and the Sorbonne, professors of international political economy interrupted their lectures to watch the live broadcast with their students, recognizing the invaluable pedagogical value of the moment. We are witnessing the real-time deconstruction of neocolonial economic structures that are usually obscured by technical jargon, a professor at the London School of Economics explained to her astonished class. Macron glanced briefly at his aides, who looked as disconcerted as he was. The French delegation, normally a well-oiled machine of diplomatic response, found itself in unfamiliar territory. Years of crisis management training had not prepared them for a situation in which the facts presented by the adversary were simultaneously devastating and incontrovertible. An uncomfortable silence fell over the French delegation as other African leaders present exchanged meaningful glances. The representatives of Mali, Niger, and Guinea, all nations with complex histories of relationships with post-colonial France, discreetly removed their translation devices, indicating that they preferred to hear directly, without intermediaries, about this historic moment. On the giant screen at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, diplomats from across the continent watched in awe. Moussa Faki Mahamat, the chair of the AU Commission, stood motionless, his hands clasped under his chin, a barely perceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I propose," Traoré finally said after allowing the silence to do its rhetorical work, deliberately softening his tone, "that we transform this moment of confrontation into an opportunity." The strategic shift surprised both outside observers and the Burkinabe delegation itself. Rather than pressing his advantage with additional accusations, the path expected by geopolitical analysts, Traoré pivoted to a constructive stance that defused in advance any attempt to portray him as merely antagonistic. Burkina Faso is ready to establish new relations with France, based on parity and genuine mutual benefit. Extending his hand across the table in a surprising gesture that perfectly captured the essence of the historic moment, he continued, "We do not want charity or guardianship, Mr. President. We want economic justice and respect for our sovereignty." Then, raising the volume of his voice slightly for the first time during the entire meeting, not in aggression, but in solemn conviction, he concluded, "The question I leave you with today is not whether Burkina Faso can survive without France, but whether the Franco-African relationship can survive without neocolonialism." The gesture took Macron completely by surprise. Trained in the best French schools to anticipate diplomatic moves, the president expected more accusations, perhaps even veiled threats of realignment with rival powers like China or Russia. Instead, he found himself faced with an offer of reconciliation conditional on fundamental transformation, a maneuver that put him in a position impossible to reject without confirming precisely the accusations of neocolonialism. For a fleeting moment, the calculating politician gave way to the man. The carefully cultivated presidential mask slipped for a split second, and his expression revealed something rarely captured on camera, a genuine mix of grudging respect and existential unease. This was not another inexperienced young leader who could be easily dismissed with diplomatic condescension. He was an intellectual equal whose moral clarity had effectively disarmed the rhetorical apparatus of one of the world's greatest powers. After a momentary hesitation that seemed like an eternity to the millions watching globally, Macron reached out and shook Traoré's hand. The gesture provoked murmurs around the room, some of surprise, some of reluctant approval, some of calculated skepticism. "Perhaps," Macron said, regaining some of his composure and turning on his diplomatic charm again, though now with a noticeable note of forced humility, "it is time to revisit certain aspects of our bilateral cooperation." The word, revisit, a typical diplomatic euphemism for admitting mistakes without actually admitting them, was not lost on political analysts. It was the closest a French president had come to publicly acknowledging the fundamental flaws in the post-colonial relationship with Africa. The cameras captured the exact moment, two leaders representing different worlds and philosophies, shaking hands as the balance of power between them visibly shifted. Not through military threats or coercive economic maneuvers, but through the simple exposure of truths long hidden behind the veils of diplomatic language. The broadcast technical director, sensing the historic magnitude of the moment, ordered a simultaneous close-up of the two men's expressions. The resulting split-screen image, Macron with his slightly strained, professional smile and eyes revealing complex calculations versus Traoré's clear, direct gaze, would be reproduced in textbooks, academic dissertations and documentaries for decades. In the days that followed, the video of the confrontation would surpass 500 million views in its first 24 hours, setting a new record for non-election political content. Volunteer translators worked tirelessly to produce subtitles in 143 languages, including indigenous and regional languages rarely represented in global diplomatic discourse. Political analysts would call it the moment that redefined Franco-African relations. Veteran journalists such as CNN's Christiane Amanpour and the BBC's Zainab Badawi would produce specials contextualizing the confrontation within the broader history of post-colonial relations. Historians would later refer to the episode as the Washington Speech, a title that would be given to dissertations, books, and eventually an award-winning documentary produced by Senegalese filmmaker Mati Diop. For the French political establishment, the event triggered an unprecedented crisis. Student demonstrations erupted in Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, demanding reforms to the country's African policies. The CFA franc, rarely discussed in mainstream political circles, suddenly became a central topic of heated parliamentary debate. Investigative journalists, emboldened by the new public attention, began publishing exposés on predatory mineral contracts in former colonies. In a symbolic gesture with significant practical consequences, the French government announced a week later that it was forming a Transparency and Renewal Commission to assess economic relations with its former colonies. The selection of Thomas Piketty, the same economist cited by Traoré, as co-chair of the commission was widely interpreted as a tacit admission of the validity of the Burkinabe leader's criticisms. For Ibrahim Traoré, those 20 minutes in Washington meant much more than a personal diplomatic victory. They represented the moment when decades of inconvenient truths finally found their way onto the world stage, illuminated by the same spotlight normally reserved for narratives carefully controlled by Western powers. The captain's return to Ouagadougou turned into a spontaneous national celebration. The normally quiet international airport was surrounded by crowds singing traditional songs and waving placards with phrases from the speech that had become popular slogans. Small children, some carried on the shoulders of proud parents, waved the national flag, the red, green, and gold star that had presided over so many transformations in the country's turbulent history. As his official plane, a modest ember that contrasted dramatically with Macron's Air France One, took off from Dulles International Airport the next morning, Traoré watched the American capital recede into the distance through the window. Washington, D.C., a city that had witnessed so many pivotal chapters in the relations between powerful nations and colonized peoples, was now adding another episode to its complex legacy. In his pocket, a small encrypted flash drive contained additional documents he had not needed to use during the confrontation. The truth, he discovered, when finally spoken aloud with clarity and precision, had its own overwhelming force that dispensed with excessive revelation. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron was calling an emergency meeting of his expanded cabinet, including experts on France-Africa relations rarely consulted in high-level decisions. In Africa, a new conversation was beginning, not just in presidential palaces and foreign ministries, but in universities, cafes, markets, and homes. It was a conversation about genuine sovereignty, about economic decolonization in addition to formal political decolonization, about a future where international relations could finally be based not on historical legacies of domination but on mutual respect between truly equal nations. And it had all started with a French spy device, inadvertently left in a ministerial conference room in Ouagadougou, a small metal object that, placed on a table in Washington, had changed the course of modern history for an entire continent. This reveal was just the beginning. Subscribe, like and share to be the first to hear about our next analysis that the big media channels don't have the courage to show.